Well, the need for employers to conduct workplace investigations and to be skilled at how they conduct them is becoming more and more important. Whether a complaint is made relating to bullying, sexual harassment, fraud, or really anything else, employers must be prepared that resolving the issue is unlikely to be a simple exercise. Let's get more on this. And for that, we spoke with Joy Poor from People and Culture Strategies and began by asking when a workplace investigation may be warranted.
I think it's important for employers to reflect on where this concept of having to conduct a workplace investigation actually comes from. And its genesis in an Australian context was very much at the time that unfair dismissal laws were introduced. And what was recognised was that if an employer was seeking to terminate the employment of an individual employee for misconduct, then it was regarded as a critical component in procedural fairness for the employer to have conducted a workplace investigation. So that's really where it all comes from. Now, in the early days of it, it was simply about an employer saying, well, look, we didn't just jump to the conclusion that they'd engaged in the misconduct. We looked into it. We did an investigation. We asked questions. We spoke to relevant people, etc. What's happened over the course of the last 30, 35 years is that this is becoming a lot more involved and a lot more complicated. And the way in which employers have to go about conducting these investigations needs to show that they are taking the issue of the process and the possible consequence and outcomes far more seriously than they might have been allowed to get away with when all of this first started.
It goes both ways though, doesn't it, Joydeep, in terms of investigation into behaviour perhaps from employees, but also from managers and the employers themselves.
Well, absolutely. And increasingly what we are seeing is that employees are a lot more comfortable and willing to make complaints against managers or supervisors, claiming, for example, that they have been bullied. We also have seen a growth in the amount of whistleblowing complaints and often whistleblowing policies, and that whole whistleblowing infrastructure necessitates that an investigation has to be conducted, regardless of what might be the likelihood of the outcome being substantiated or not. So you're absolutely right. There are lots of different ways in which the need for such an investigation can come about.
How should it be determined whether an investigation is done internally or perhaps there is the need for an independent investigation?
Yeah, it's often the most important question. I think the starting point needs to be that the employer should think through what might be the criticisms of an investigation if it is done internally. So some of the issues that might be the subject of that criticism are a relationship, for example, or a familiarity that the person who internally is conducting the investigation has with one of the people involved in the investigation. Generally speaking, employers should, where it involves matters such as sexual harassment, where naturally the ramifications of it being found to have occurred and also the potential publicity media interest in that kind of a matter in their organisation is higher than it would be in other cases. So those kinds of allegations tend to necessitate an independent investigation. But often what we find, and we do a lot of these investigations, we advise on a lot of these investigations, is that once the process starts, then the employer finds themselves losing control over that process pretty quickly. And it's almost as though the investigation becomes the focus and almost becomes an institution in itself, and it's deviated away from the substance of what that investigation was looking into. And often these investigations can last months, and there's lawyers at 1,000 paces, and everyone's wanting to assert their rights, and as such, at the back end of it, it's often untenable for a range of people that were involved in the investigation to stay employed. And that's something that I think employers need to be very mindful of, is that end point. And sure, you've got to get the process right, but what happens at the back end of it, regardless of findings, if it has been the case that this has almost become an institution in itself.
Joydeep, at what point would you be calling in the lawyers? What's that tipping point, if you like?
Well, I think the guidance I give to my clients early on is, as much as this might be against my own interests, is that they should feel comfortable with saying to someone who's making an allegation or complaint, what it is and asking them what it is that they are seeking from it. And they should feel comfortable explaining to that individual what an investigation process might look like, just so that they are going into it eyes wide open. A lot of people who make complaints think that even when they hear someone tell them that it's going to be investigated, they think that that means nothing more than a couple of conversations and that everything's going to be done and dusted in 2 or 3 days. And so often surprised when the big guns are brought in, whether it's lawyers, whether it's independent investigators or whatever else. Now, that can only work where the allegations are more of a perhaps interpersonal conflict, what I describe as low-level bullying, certainly anything that involves financial misappropriation, anything that could border on criminal conduct. They're the matters where employers should be bringing in the lawyers pretty early.
When you consider a investigation, perhaps at a government level, cynically at least, it's often said that you wouldn't embark on an investigation or an inquiry unless you actually know the outcome before you embark on that. Does that also perhaps apply for employers, that they want to take that safety? They want to know the outcome before they actually launch it?
Yeah, I think I completely understand where that perception does come from. I think there is still some merit to it, although employers, in my experience and observation at the moment, are a lot more careful about how it could be perceived, what the optics are of them not conducting an investigation, even where it might seem to them that there's no merit to it. And particularly where we know that the actions of senior decision makers, the C-suite within organisations, for example, is becoming increasingly scrutinised. We know that the relationships that exist or are argued to exist between peers or people at that C-suite level is often the subject of concern and criticism. So for that reason, while I think there's still some merit to it, it's far less of a reality than perhaps was the case before.
All right, so there is that imperative for transparency.
Absolutely. And I think that the challenge is a lot of employers have become so focused on the transparency and the process that they are forgetting that point around where is this going to end? How are we going to continue to run a business? How are we going to get these people to get back to work and do what we need them to be doing? Or are we just resigned to the fact that, we've started the investigation, that's just going to take as long as it takes, and we really don't care what happens to the individuals. And I think employers run the risk at the moment of being too focused on that process side rather than taking a step back and thinking about the bigger picture.